In March of 2003, the United States invasion of Iraq, which aimed to overthrow the infamous Saddam Hussein, created a massive amount of instability in the Middle East. Jihadist groups were able to flourish in the chaos, and in 2004, Al-Qaeda was officially formed. One particular division of Al-Qaeda, however, would soon go on to become the most recognized international name in extremism for almost a decade. Near constant conflict across the regions of Iraq and then later Syria would allow for this brutal branch of jihadists to maintain a base of devoted and dangerous followers. By 2011, when the Syrian civil war commenced, that same sense of instability allowed for the establishment of a new reincarnation of Al-Qaeda, this time under the name the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, otherwise known as ISIS. ISIS would go on to terrorize much of the world throughout their time in power, the peak of which lasted for several tumultuous years. Thousands of foreign extremists would travel to ISIS-controlled territories in order to fight alongside the jihadists of the Islamic State, while the group reeled in millions upon millions of dollars via the sale of oil and the payment of ransom money for the many people they had abducted. During the mid-2010s, ISIS would launch a series of domestic and international terrorist attacks against the citizens of Iraq, Syria, Turkey, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, France, the United Kingdom, the United States, and beyond. These attacks would attract global support on a massive scale for those afflicted, whilst the group continued to kidnap, execute, and brutalize captives in the Middle East. In today's video, we'll be examining the rise of ISIS in full, taking a deep dive into how this group formed, and who was predominantly behind its spread. We will take a look at some of ISIS's biggest atrocities and conflicts, before examining their eventual fall from power. What was it that made ISIS so notorious and feared across the Middle East and beyond? How did the Islamic State come to be, and ultimately what brought it to its knees? Join us as we find out and explore. Please note that this video will contain discussions of human rights abuses, violence, and terrorism. Viewer discretion is advised. Welcome to Wars of the World. The man most commonly credited with being the founder and first official leader of the Islamic State is Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Al-Baghdadi started his adult life as a teacher, having obtained a degree from the Islamic University of Baghdad in the early 2000s, but was ultimately destined for something much darker. Reports differ on exactly how Baghdadi became radicalized. Some state that he began developing an extremist ideology under the Iraqi rule of Saddam Hussein, but others claim that he may have been molded into an extremist during his time spent with the Muslim Brotherhood as a young man. But those who knew al-Baghdadi during his time in education state that he was quiet, perhaps even shy, and for the most part, he went unnoticed. In the mid-2000s, al-Baghdadi started to become enamored with the writings of Egyptian jihadist scholar Sayyid Qutb, who was associated with the Muslim Brotherhood himself. Following the American invasion of Iraq, his views led him to found Jamit Jaish al-Sunnah wal Jama'ah, or JJASJ, a militant organization that ultimately allied with Al-Qaeda in order to fight the United States troops. Alongside Al-Qaeda, Baghdadi would expand his influence across Iraq as an Islamic extremist, and soon he became a well-known figure amidst the jihadist movements of the Middle East. Al-Baghdadi's involvement with JJASJ and his affiliation with Al-Qaeda soon led to his arrest by US forces stationed in Iraq in 2004. He was detained at the Camp Bucca detention center by the end of that year, deemed only to be a low-level threat. While detained, he gathered several jihadist allies who would be just as instrumental in the formation of the Islamic State. When al-Baghdadi was released from custody, he and the remaining members of the JJASJ joined the Mujahideen Shura Council, an umbrella organization linking the major extremist groups of the Middle East. Al-Qaeda's forces played a major role within the council, and soon a proto-Islamic State will be formed within it. This early iteration of ISIS, which included members of the JJASJ and Al-Qaeda, along with those allied to several other extremist groups, was formed in 2006 and became known as the Islamic State of Iraq, or ISI. Al-Baghdadi would then be announced as ISI's leader in May of 2010, where he would become responsible for spearheading multiple terrorist attacks within Iraq. One such attack was the August 2011 bombing of Baghdad's al-Qura Mosque, which ended the life of a prominent Sunni Muslim lawmaker, Khalid al-Fadawi. When Al-Qaeda's founder, Osama bin Laden, was killed by US Navy SEALs in that same year, al-Baghdadi swore retaliation and proceeded to carry out raids, bombings, and shootings across many cities and countryside areas throughout Iraq. By the end of 2011, the blood of hundreds of innocent lives were on his hands, and things were only bound to get worse. Al-Baghdadi announced the formation of the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant officially in 2013, when extremists moved into Syria. ISIS was now a major threat to peace in the Middle East and beyond, and by June of 2014, al-Baghdadi had aimed to turn his growing terrorist organization into a worldwide caliphate. Under the name Caliph Ibrahim, al-Baghdadi faced significant backlash from government officials, Muslim theologians, and even other jihadist groups. A caliph, historically, was required to be the most pious individual of all, and al-Baghdadi was criticized for failing to uphold the traditions and practices of Islam almost immediately. He would call for violent attacks to be carried out against the people of other nations, and he took international prisoners. Some of ISIS's prisoners were reportedly kept by al-Baghdadi as personal slaves, and he prolifically abused them throughout their captivity. The Islamic State was soon labeled as a global terrorist organization, and al-Baghdadi and those working under him were labeled as wanted men. Knowing how ISIS rose to power is one thing, but what exactly did they aim to achieve, and how did they become so prevalent? Well, the ideology of the Islamic State can be traced back to the writings of Sayyid Qutb, the radical scholar that al-Baghdadi had spent so much time studying. Qutb's political ideas, which depended heavily on the idea of takfir, the forcible excommunication from Islam of one Muslim by another, were taken to the extremes by ISIS, and they attempted to bring their lands under the Sharia laws of Islam. ISIS adopted their own variant of Muhammad's battle flag, the Black Standard. Their version, which was intended to display an extreme religious and political message, displayed the seal of Muhammad within a white circle against the traditional black background. The words, "There is no God but Allah," sit ominously above. ISIS aimed to create a global, totalitarian caliphate the world over, which would be governed by their own extreme interpretations of Sharia law. They wished to restore what they viewed to be the pure form of early Islam, and started to request that Muslims all over the world join their cause. And indeed, the idea of a global jihad did have the effect of drawing in Islamic extremists from across the globe. A large-scale propaganda machine, driven by social media, aimed to seek out individuals who might have felt down and out, those who felt that society had marginalized them, or those who sought a sense of purpose. In addition to targeting those most vulnerable online, ISIS also targeted mosques and prisons, where individuals could be recruited face to face. Most disturbingly though, the Islamic State also sought out the support of minors, indoctrinating families and schools within their territory that had already been claimed by ISIS. Children who had been displaced from their homes as a result of conflict in the Middle East were extremely vulnerable to ISIS propaganda, and the terrorists were relentless in their search for new recruits. Throughout 2014, the Islamic State managed to recruit a huge amount of new members, and they peaked in terms of size in 2015. By this point, they controlled a huge amount of land, almost 110,000 square kilometers, and they maintained a stranglehold on major cities in both Iraq and Syria. The estimates range greatly on just how many extremists had joined up with ISIS by the time they peaked in size. Lower estimates range from 35 to 40,000, while the upper end considers up to 100 to 200,000. An estimated 40,000 additional ISIS members were recruited from overseas propaganda campaigns, who either remained in their home countries as recruiters or relocated to join the cause in the Middle East. Throughout its domain, the Islamic State hosted some of the most terrifying and unjust atrocities that the modern world has ever seen. These atrocities were carried out both within the territory of the Islamic State and overseas, in the form of attempted genocides, kidnappings, executions, and terrorist attacks. One of ISIS's first moves upon taking power was to systematically attempt to rid their lands of any Muslim who did not follow the Sunni branch of Islam. The Sunni branch of Islam is rooted in the idea that caliphs should be elected, while the minority Shia branch believes that leadership should remain within the Prophet Muhammad's bloodline. In the eyes of the Islamic State, anybody who was not a practicing Sunni Muslim was fit to be destroyed, and so they set out to kill anybody who disagreed with them, including the Yazidis, who were a Kurdish-speaking ethno-religious group based in Iraq and Syria, along with Shia Muslims, Assyrian Christians, and any Sunni Muslims who protested their ideology or authority. The Yazidis faced a massive wave of persecution at the hands of ISIS. They were deemed to be inherently anti-Muslim, even devil-worshipping by the extremists in their practices, and as such, ISIS sought to wipe them out through any means possible. Yazidis across ISIS-owned territories were systematically rounded up and executed. Primarily, ISIS would kill men and older women in this manner. Younger women and even children were habitually kept alive, where they would be taken as slaves by prominent members of the Islamic State's government. The Yazidi genocide was persistently carried out from 2014 to 2017, in which 500,000 Yazidis are believed to have lost their lives. Between 4,000 and 11,000 others were taken prisoner as captives or as slaves by the terrorists, where they would be forced to convert from Yazidism to Islam. As you can probably imagine, anybody taken captive as a slave of the Islamic State would suffer terribly. Many of these prisoners were young women, some as young as 9 years old, who were often trafficked into a life of abuse at the hands of these terrorists. Any women who resisted the advances of the Islamic State were often executed, and violence became a massive part of their everyday life. But it wasn't just Iraqi and Syrian citizens who suffered under ISIS's doctrine. When the United States military stepped in to conduct airstrikes on Islamic State-controlled territory towards the end of 2014, ISIS took foreign soldiers, journalists, and aid workers as captives. The Islamic State took these captives in what they justified as retaliation for the American-led intervention in Iraq, taking place in August of 2014. Execution of ISIS's captives commenced in July of 2014, when 75 Syrian soldiers were beheaded. The videos of these killings were then posted to social media. The first international journalist to be killed by the Islamic State was James Wright Foley, an American freelancer who had been taking photos of the Syrian civil war in 2012. Foley's murderer was a British Islamic State recruit, known at the time only as Jihadi John, a member of a 4-person cell, all with English accents, who were nicknamed the Beatles by their hostages. Jihadi John would eventually be identified as Mohammed Emwazi. Emwazi would become a prolific ISIS executioner throughout the group's existence, and would often appear on videos posted to social media, wearing a black mask in order to conceal his identity as he beheaded his victims. Amongst Emwazi's victims were American journalist Stephen Sotloff, British aid workers David Haynes and Alan Henning, American aid worker Peter Kassig, and Japanese freelance journalists Haruna Yakawa and Kenji Goto. Emwazi soon became the subject of a massive international manhunt, and was brought to justice in November of 2015, when American drones conducted an airstrike on his location, killing him in Raqqa, Syria. While these horrors were ensuing in the Middle East, ISIS took their terrorism overseas, targeting members of the public of foreign countries in calculated bombings and killings. The first of these international terrorist attacks took place in May of 2014, when radicalized Islamist Mehdi Nemmouche shot and killed 3 people and injured 1 more at the Jewish Museum in Brussels, Belgium. Amongst Nemmouche's possessions following his arrest were an audio recording of himself claiming responsibility for the attack, and a white sheet printed with symbolism of the Islamic State. Further attacks would go on to instill fear of and resistance to ISIS across the world. In June of 2016, 49 people were mercilessly killed at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, Florida, when shooter Omar Mateen began taking hostages and firing into the crowd. Although it is unknown if Mateen was a member of ISIS, the group praised him as, quote, one of the soldiers of the Caliphate in America after the attack took place. Mateen was killed by police 3 hours after the shooting began. In November of 2015, a series of terrorist attacks were carried out by ISIS and their supporters in Paris, France, which shook the international community to its core. Combined, these bombings and shootings killed a collective 130 people and wounded 350 more. Their targets included the Bataclan concert hall and an international football match. Similarly, in May of 2017, ISIS would take credit for the bombing of the Manchester Arena in the United Kingdom. Salman and Hashem Abedi targeted an Ariana Grande concert taking place at the arena using an improvised nail bomb. This would kill 22 people and injure over 1,000 more. In the Middle East and Africa, the attacks were both frequent and persistent. The infamous attack on the Corinthia Hotel in Tripoli, Libya, in January of 2015 killed 10 people, with ISIS claiming responsibility for these murders. Just 2 months later, 137 people were killed in Yemen when ISIS bombed 2 mosques in Sana'a, Yemen, while in April, videos were released of the beheadings of 30 Ethiopian Christians. Saudi Arabia, Tunisia, Egypt, Turkey, Lebanon, Somalia, Nigeria, and Niger all suffered similar assaults. In West Africa, Boko Haram had spread alarmingly fast as a jihadist group allied to the Islamic State, who were committing similar atrocities. There was no denying it. From their conception, ISIS were a group that needed to be stopped. To let this growing threat continue to spread without intervention would have been a major threat to global peace and stability. And so, in the September of 2014, international coalitions against the Islamic State began to take form. The largest of these was Operation Inherent Resolve, spearheaded by the United States military, who worked alongside forces from the United Kingdom, Germany, Denmark, France, Canada, Australia, Turkey, and Italy to put a stop to ISIS's reign of terror. The United States weren't the only nation to form coalitions against the Islamic State, however. An operation was also soon formed, led by France, that would see support from up to 26 additional nations. Known as Operation Shamal, France would be joined by the likes of China, Lebanon, Norway, Japan, the UAE, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia to help tackle the growing threat in Iraq and Syria. A separate coalition, known as the Islamic Military Alliance, would be formed in Saudi Arabia in 2015. This would consist of up to 34 Muslim states, many of whom had been terrorized by ISIS in the previous months. Amongst these members were Bahrain, Nigeria, Sudan, Pakistan, Jordan, Malaysia, and Libya. However, signs were beginning to emerge that as early as the end of 2014, that ISIS may have been collapsing as a result of their own actions. While they had successfully captured territory in both Syria and Iraq, they had struggled to reach beyond these regions. Towards the end of 2014, they had attempted to seize control of Kobane, a town on the Syrian border with Turkey. The Islamic State had sent thousands of insurgents to seize more land, but they were met with United States airstrikes when they arrived. Wave after wave of terrorists were killed. Over 1,500 had died in airstrikes at Kobane alone. What started as a failed land grab for the jihadists had turned into a failed attempt at a show of strength, as they continued to send fighters to their deaths. Between the start of 2015 and mid-2016, ISIS slowly began to lose the ground that they had worked hard to gain, as airstrikes prevented them from expanding into new lands. Mosul, a major city in Iraq that ISIS had captured early on in their territorial expansion, now became a corner that the extremists were backed into. Around this point in their story, ISIS's leaders told prospective terrorists that they should not travel to the Middle East in order to join the Islamic State. Rather, those loyal to ISIS were asked to conduct bombings and shootings in their home countries. This was a major shift in attitude from the rampant recruitment program that had been the focal point of the Islamic State's plans, used in the previous months and years, and it coincided with more major territorial losses. The jihadists found that they could not easily maintain the land that they had easily captured in the early stages of their takeover, and the international coalitions were steadily closing in. Towards the end of 2016, another blow was struck right into the heart of the Islamic State. Kurdish and Iraqi forces, who had been struggling to defend their lands against the rising terror, managed to reclaim their hold on Mosul. Working alongside the nations involved in Operation Inherent Resolve, this was the largest military operation since the 2003 United States invasion of Iraq. Since 2015, Operation Inherent Resolve had been bombing high-profile ISIS targets around the city, and Iraqi forces had been steadily closing in. But now was the time to take back the city. Pro-Iraqi government forces entered the city from the north, the south, and the east, taking satellite towns on their way, and quashing fierce resistance from Islamic State fighters. The further they got into Mosul's center, the harder it was to push back against the terrorists within, however. The Battle of Mosul was costly for the city. Hundreds upon hundreds of buildings were destroyed in the fighting, leaving much of the area in ruins. By January of 2017, Iraqi Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi announced that the eastern reaches of the city were back under government control, but the western side proved to be more difficult. The buildings in western Mosul were packed in very tightly, making it hard for troops to advance, and creating funnel points where terrorist bombers and snipers could easily pick off Iraqi soldiers. Ultimately, forces succeeded in taking back the city of Mosul from the Islamic State, but an immense amount of damage had been dealt in the process. 5 main bridges in Mosul's center had been leveled in order to stop ISIS's ability to resupply, and the only other route for vehicles into the city center was destroyed by a United States coalition airstrike at the end of 2016. What had once been Iraq's second largest city now lay in ruins. Mosul was deemed to have been officially liberated from the Islamic State in July of 2017. Then, in the late stages of 2017, another key location, Raqqa in Syria, was retaken from the Islamic State. Leading the charge against Raqqa were the Syrian Democratic Forces, an alliance of both Arab and Kurdish militias, who initially entered the city in an attempt to reclaim it in June of 2017. Raqqa was amongst the earliest of the large cities claimed by the jihadists in 2014, and since then they had been using it as a major hub for both planning attacks and calculating their next moves. The Syrian Democratic Forces launched their attack from all sides, encircling the city early on and slowly attempting to move in towards the center. They faced resistance from ISIS bombers, gunmen, and snipers as they advanced, and many soldiers and civilians were wounded in the early days of the fighting. By the end of July, the Democratic Forces had successfully captured several neighborhoods to the south of the city, and they were closing in on the center. United States airstrikes did help to limit the success of ISIS fighters within the city, but they also ended the lives of fleeing civilians as a result. By the September of 2017, only small pockets of jihadists remained in the city, and the Syrian Democratic Forces had recaptured the majority of Raqqa. The battle came to a close when soldiers launched an attack on Raqqa's stadium, where the final jihadists were holed up in the city. By the 20th of October, the Democratic Forces had declared their victory. Now that the major Islamic State strongholds had been seized from terrorist control, ISIS had few places left to turn. They were diminishing in number, thanks to the continued airstrikes from international coalitions, and the work of ground operations led by Iraqi and Syrian forces. Members of ISIS now began to gather their families and relocate to the eastern reaches of Syria, specifically to a small town by the name of Baghouz. By this point in time, ISIS had lost up to 95% of their initial territory, and they were backed into the smallest of corners. Baghouz had little in the way of allowing the terrorists to continue their campaigns and their brutal attacks. The clock was ticking, and soldiers were moving in ever closer. Baghouz is believed to have played host to several thousand ISIS members as they fled from their former territories. When the terrorists arrived, many of Baghouz's citizens opted to flee to refugee camps established by the Syrian Democratic Forces, but many of those that stayed would perish in the oncoming airstrikes and attacks. In February of 2019, coalition forces had caught up with the remaining insurgents cornered in Baghouz, and plans were set into motion to stamp out the threat of ISIS once and for all. The fighting commenced with heavy fire raining down by mortar teams belonging to the Democratic Forces, while United States bombers and snipers sought to lay waste to any terrorists stationed within the outskirts of the town. Over 40 important points within the town that provided a strategic advantage to the coalition were seized in the early days of the assault, and several ISIS counterattacks were successfully repelled. By this point, the ISIS militants in Baghouz were starting to get desperate. Some attempted to flee the town, being disguised as women and joining the thousands of civilians that were pouring out of the buildings and into the trucks bound for refugee camps. Dust storms began to batter Baghouz as fiercely as the airstrikes and gunfire, but the coalition forces still succeeded in taking back large tracts of land within the town's limits. As the soldiers pressed on, ISIS insurgents were reportedly spotted using civilians as human shields in order to deter shots against them. It was soon reported that ISIS leaders had authorized the execution of several of their own fighters for attempting to surrender to coalition forces. The town center would then be breached and captured by the Democratic Forces on the 13th of February. By the 16th, Jaya Furat, a commander in the Syrian Democratic Forces, stated that ISIS's total territory now spanned only 700 square meters. They had been pushed out of the city center and had attempted to flee to a series of small hamlets on the outskirts of Baghouz. Now the Democratic Forces issued an ultimatum to the remaining militants. They could surrender now or prepare to die in battle. The vast majority of those left alive chose to fight. But there was a problem. Several hundred civilians remained trapped alongside the fighters, who were at a serious risk of dying if the soldiers moved in to fight. Over the course of a week, many civilians slowly managed to flee the hamlets, and several groups of ISIS fighters opted to surrender. The battle continued sporadically over the course of the following months. Civilians and ISIS fighters continued to remain in the hamlets outside of Baghouz, and the Syrian Democratic Forces continued to besiege the area, waiting the terrorists out. Many of the remaining insurgents, deemed to be ISIS's most die-hard jihadists, decided to dig tunnels under the settlements, where they holed up in makeshift bunkers. Above ground, however, and in the surrounding settlements, many of the extremists were soon captured by the Democratic Forces. According to a forces spokesman, Mustafa Bali, Over 4,000 jihadists had either surrendered or had been captured since the fighting at Baghouz had begun, leaving those that were left behind exhausted but unwilling to surrender. By the 10th of March, the democratic forces declared that no remaining civilians were left within the ISIS-occupied hamlets, and the assault was resumed. What followed was a barrage of machine gun fire, airstrikes, and the raining down of mortars on ISIS's final position. The terrorists responded with bombings of their own, but they failed to inflict any severe damage on either the coalitions or the Syrian Democratic Forces. A further 1,300 jihadists reportedly surrendered on the 14th of March, and soldiers were able to capture their encampment by the 19th. Total control over the Baghouz area and victory over the remaining insurgents was declared by the 23rd of March 2019. Since the ultimate collapse of the Islamic State in March of 2019, up to 26,000 individuals suspected to have been involved in the organization have been detained in prisons run by Syria and the United States. While many of those detained are terrorists who were heavily involved in the atrocities carried out by ISIS, many of those in custody are there unlawfully. Human rights groups and charities have been campaigning for the release of those held without reason or evidence, but many remain incarcerated today. Prisons within Syria that hold confirmed terrorists often become hotbeds for the spread of radical jihadist thought. While the Islamic State was thoroughly and efficiently quashed by coalition troops and government forces in the Middle East, pockets of the organization are thought to still remain even today. As of April 2025, the Peace Research Institute in Frankfurt, a group of leading analysts of global conflict, estimate that there could be as many as 2,500 ISIS terrorists who have evaded capture. Although anything left of ISIS today is a mere shadow of its former self, the threat of terrorism returning in the future must be constantly monitored in order to prevent anything like this from happening again. As for Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the founder of ISIS, he took his own life during a United States-led military operation in northern Syria in October of 2019. Reportedly, al-Baghdadi detonated explosives strapped to a vest as he fled from the United States forces into a tunnel. The explosion reportedly killed 3 of al-Baghdadi's children, and no United States military personnel were harmed. Now, without a territory or a leading figurehead, ISIS may no longer possess the means to return to their former power, and hopefully it will remain that way. Over the course of their reign of terror, ISIS were responsible for thousands upon thousands of deaths, but international cooperation and the desire to stamp out terrorism forever eventually prevailed in the end. Our thoughts go out to all of those affected by the acts and atrocities of the Islamic State. Thank you for watching today's video. If you found it informative, please leave a like or a comment down below. All of our content, from the research and script writing to the editing and narration, is completely human-driven, without the use of AI. So if you want to support our channel, consider subscribing, and use the bell icon to get notifications on when the next Wars of the World video is released.